Hello, everyone. This is Sean from a Soccer Nostalgia blog. I have the pleasure to interview usual podcast partner, English blogger, and now author, Mr. Paul Whittle, regarding his book. Last year, Mr. Whittle published his first book, Before the Premier League, A History of Football League's Last Decades. This video interview is separate from the podcast series. Hello, Paul. A long overdue interview for your book. Please introduce yourself for any new listeners.
Oh, Sean, thank you for inviting me to do this. I'm a lifelong football fan. I was born in 1973 in Leeds, and I went to my first game in 1980. I played and watched football even when there was a lot less of it on TV, and I just was interested in finding out whatever I could about the game. As many of our guests say, once it starts, you're hooked. That's it. And I'd read annuals and book programs, Panini albums, Match and Shoot magazines, really whatever I could find out. And that's continued to some extent over the years. And now I have a football history blog called the 1888 Letter, and I have the pleasure of joining you for the Soccer Nostalgia Talk podcast.
Thank you. Now, before we get into the depth of the book, please describe the book and its contents.
It's essentially, as the title suggests, a history of the last years of the Football League as it was, with 92 clubs, 4 divisions, the structure that I grew up with. It focuses on the period from 1958 to 1992 and basically looks at the main changes and developments in that time span that led to the creation of the Premier League. So I'm looking at the abolition of the maximum wage, the influence of sponsorship and television, hooliganism and the tragedies of the 80s, the transfer market and the introduction of foreign players, how all these factors were starting to change English football even before the Premier League, really. As part of the history, there's a section of statistics covering the league up to 1992. And the second half of the book is interviews with fans and players from that era.
So, for the record, football did exist before 1992.
My research suggests so. Yeah.
At least for those of us of
Hard
a
to
certain
believe.
age. Yeah.
Yeah, hard to believe. I know. It did.
So, when did you decide to write this book? And most particularly, what sparked your interest?
It's probably stopping playing about 10 years ago. Um, and I started thinking, it'd always been a vague idea. I started thinking more seriously about writing. And I always had the idea of a book about English football history, but I didn't have a specific focus to it. And really, what helped give it focus and the main inspiration was a book called 60 Seasons of League Football by R.C. Churchill, which was actually published in 1958 and covered the league's history up to that point from its formation in 1888. And it was broken down into a summary of the different periods of the league up to that point, and it also had statistics for the different clubs in the league. So I started out with that in mind. Gradually, the statistical part became less important, although there is still a section in the book. And I basically went through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and early 90s, adding the main changes and looking at the significant events along the way.
So, what made you decide on the format of the first half being that of cold hard facts and the second half of interviews?
Obviously, the history, as I've written it, and the statistics were the main focus of the book as it started out. And as time went on, I just felt that it would benefit from having some first-hand accounts, which should really bring that history to life. And I was lucky enough to have some contacts that got me started on that, to talk to different people. And when I was able to add ex-professionals, that their lived experience was really important. It illustrated the points that I was trying to make in the book, and in the end, really, I gave that equal weight to the half of the book that I'd written.
So, how do you choose the interviewees and how was the interview process? By that, I mean, how different was it from person to person in general?
Well, the chance to interview the ex-players came from a childhood friend of mine, Joe Sargison, who now works for the FA and he's worked for different professional clubs. And we were talking about the book, and he mentioned a couple of names to me, which included Paul Davis, and naturally I jumped at that opportunity. So Joe made the introduction, and I actually went down to St George's Park to meet Paul Davis, which was a little bit nerve-wracking, but also a great experience. And he was followed by Nigel Gleghorn, and that was also through Joe. And then what I found was it was a lot easier after that. That when I was contacting people, I was able to mention those names, and then people knew that it was a serious project and that there were credible people already involved in it. I wanted to cover as long a time frame as I could, go back a bit further than the 80s, and also try and speak to players that played in each division to give as broad a picture as possible as life in the football league. But really, it was just a matter of finding contacts. Sometimes I'd contact ex-players associations, getting in touch with the players and seeing if they were interested in talking. Much like the podcast, sometimes it was a little bit hit and miss, but I'm really pleased with the range of interviewees that I managed to get for the book.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, we both know how difficult it is to obtain interviews. Uh, but I seem to remember you once mentioning it's probably easier to interview former players of a certain generation rather than obviously the current one. Can you get more into that?
Yeah, I found that once I actually made contact with the players, they were all really friendly, very generous with their time, and they actually seemed to enjoy the chance to reminisce, especially those players who were maybe a little bit lower profile and possibly aren't interviewed as much these days. And not one of them mentioned money. And my perception is that current players are going to be a little bit less accessible, and certainly in the future there'll be agents to go through, and in many instances I would guess that money would be involved, and that just wasn't the case. It was really refreshing. It was just people that wanted to talk about their careers and relive a little bit of their personal history.
Yeah. This is your first book and everything is new. Can you describe the process of finding a publisher, obtaining photographs, and any other things that we might not know about?
Yeah, that's it was an interesting process. The researching and writing it was one thing, very enjoyable, but actually getting it published and getting it out there was the difficult part. I initially sent a summary of the idea and samples of the chapters to different publishers, and some of them were quite positive and gave me good feedback, but didn't actually want to take a chance on it. And some of them didn't reply at all, and obviously I'm not known at all, and I don't have connections really that would help me in that world. And I think it can be quite a complicated process. We know there's a lot of competition, a lot of football books out there. Eventually, I contacted Rick Holden for an interview, and through that, Rick was really enthusiastic about the idea, and I ended up working with his publishing company, Whittle, and him and Dave Moore at Whittle were really helpful with the editing and the formatting and the sort of technical aspect of putting the book together. And I've just been trying to promote it as best I can since then. The photographs, that was also an interesting part of it. And I knew that ideally I wanted original photos taken by fans during the period that I was writing about. So the cover images came from John Dewhurst, who's also an author and a Bradford football historian, and James Court, and that was a photo taken by his dad, Peter. Managed to get in touch with different club historians and fans who provided images from their own collections. It's very expensive to go down the route of official licensed photographs, so I didn't have a budget for that at all. So I'm really grateful for the people that helped out, and again, really pleased with the images that I ended up with.
Yes. And just as an aside, what is something that you learn in going through the process that the average person might not know about?
Um, I think just the difficulty of conveying the idea to people, and even if they see a sample of it, I think they take a lot of convincing, especially if you're not someone who's already got a reputation and has got credentials. And really, I was just writing out of the blue to people, um, and it's a challenge, but I certainly wouldn't deter people from trying it. But I think you have to be realistic. It was probably at least a year, if not more, before I really had any encouragement that I was going to be able to publish it in the form that I wanted.
Right. So the publishers, were they encouraging of the format you wanted to, or did they have their own ideas for you to take a look at? Or
They were often positive about the writing, and I have a feeling they were a little bit more dubious about the concept. And also, I mean, part of the reason for dropping the statistics down from what they were a couple of people just said, well, all that information's on the internet anyway. It doesn't need to be in a book format anyway, which yeah, I took that on board, although, personally I'm quite keen on books with statistics in, and I suspect quite a few people are, but yeah, it's because it's quite a broad um, concept as well. I think there's a lot of books that focus on either particular clubs or managers or players, or even specific seasons that maybe in some ways it's easier to convey that idea, and depending on you know who who that player is, or who that club is, there's kind of a ready-made market for it. So I can see that might be, in some respects, easier to persuade a publisher to go with.
yeah. And you mentioned Rick Holden. Last year, I guess more than a year ago, like on around October 2021, shortly after you had published your book, we got the chance to interview Mr. Holden, Mr. Rick Holden, the former Oldham player, who was, as you mentioned, one of the interviews in your book. Now, how different did that particular interview, the podcast interview, feel compared to the one that you had made in your book?
Yeah, the book interview was, as I say, I contacted Rick out of the blue. I didn't know him at all. I'd seen him play many times, um, and he was instrumental really in getting it published and helping me to publish, and he became very involved in it. Um, and that first conversation I had with him, we had quite a long discussion. Again, he was very generous with his time, and I edited that down for the final version. So I think by the time we spoke to him, obviously, I had some pre-existing relationship, and it seemed a little bit more informal and spontaneous. We were able to interact a bit more with the format of the podcast. I think we got to see that he's a real character, maybe a bit different from the stereotypes that people have in mind of footballers.
Yes. So, any future books on the pipeline?
I'm not working on anything at the moment. I'm really pleased with the book, but it is a big commitment, and I'd have to have an idea that I was really, you know, prepared to devote that amount of time to again. time and energy to doing. So it's not on the horizon immediately, but I wouldn't rule it out. What I'm doing at the moment really is trying to use the blog to expand on some of the themes of the book. For example, at the moment, I'm doing a series on foreign players in the Football League. I've had the help of experts from different countries, talking about the players from Argentina and Yugoslavia for starters, and that'll continue. And it just allows me to go into a little bit more depth on those subjects, and in this instance, go country by country. So the idea is that hopefully if people like those posts and the things that I'm writing about, they'll also be interested in the book.
Yeah. In fact, I remember you mentioned you probably started working on your book before we got to know each other, right? So this been some it took some many years until it got to its final form, I assume, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. Yeah, as I said, it was just started out as a vague idea, something about English football history. I didn't really feel um, that I was able to cover the whole history from 1888. That would be a huge task. People have written great books about the early years of the league and different eras, but to do the whole thing would really be a monumental task. So the idea that the Churchill book inspired of taking it from 1958, it sort of gave it a focus. That was the first time that there'd been four national divisions. Before that, the bottom two divisions had been divided geographically north and south. And then that was the structure that basically remained in place until the Premier League. That was what I grew up with, the four division systems, the 92 clubs, the kind of unified football league. And obviously it made it easier that at least part of that period was within my own memory. And then part of that, going back a generation to my dad's generation, it wasn't going back into history that was too distant for me to feel able to tackle. It just made it all more manageable. But yeah, it took a long time to get it to the final format.
All right. So, in closing, how has the book been received? I imagine it's mostly people of a certain age, like our generation, maybe or older, looking back to a foregone football era.
Yeah, certainly. And I have to be honest, it can be a challenge to sell it. As I've mentioned, there's so much competition, so many football books, great books coming out all the time about all aspects of football history, really. And this is just me without a marketing budget or anything like that. But it's really nice. It means a lot to sell any copies really to me, and I've had some really positive feedback, which makes it worthwhile. It's fantastic when I get word of mouth recommendations, people that have enjoyed it and pass it on to somebody else. But yeah, the main market, realistically, it's going to be long-term fans of a certain age who've grown up with this history and have an interest in it. But I'm always hopeful that it'll reach some younger fans as well who want to learn about the past and how English football's changed over the decades.
Yeah, well, with that, I would like to thank you for this interview. Knowing you these last few years and embarking on this collaboration and the podcast adventure has been priceless, fun, and an enriching experience as we have gotten to know so many football history fans from all over the world. And I wish you luck with this book and hopefully many more in the future. Uh, to remind everyone to please read the main blog article as well for more detail. The link is included on the video upload description, along with our respective contact information. So thank you again.
Thank you very much, Sean, and I echo your words. It's been a great experience, and we learn in every podcast. So it's fantastic to find these people like ourselves around the world with this interest, or some might say obsession with the game.
Right.
But yeah, long may it continue.
Indeed, indeed. Thanks again.
Thank you.